Would you like to learn how to make ooey gooey butter tarts, a Canadian classic? Stay tuned to the next episode of Hilltop Stovetop. Welcome back to Hilltop Stovetop, the show where we're teaching you how to make great meals in an ordinary kitchen. Today we are continuing our series of recipes based on the Coronation Cookbook from the Teulon United Church Circle in 1953. This cookbook was compiled to commemorate the coronation of Queen Elizabeth, and so we're doing a little bit of a series here in honor of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee. Now, today we're going to be tackling butter tarts. Now, I'm here alone right at the moment because I'm going to be starting the pastry, which does need to be chilled for a little while. And once the pastry is chilled, then I am going to be joined by a special guest. So there'll be a little bit of a conversation happening as we go. So we're going to be featuring two recipes today, actually. First off, we have to make the pastry for these tarts. Full disclosure, normally when I'm making tarts, I buy the pre-made tart shells that come in the freezer section at the store because they are a little bit finicky. But for the purpose of this video, I am going to go ahead and do the pastry. I found this one particular pastry which is really very, very, very easy and I think will work very well for tarts. It's not quite as flaky as the pastry that I normally make, but nonetheless, it is just right for these tarts. And this is a hot water pastry, which was submitted by Mrs. R. Ellison. And then once we've got that all put together, we're going to be doing the butter tarts that were put in by Mrs. Pete Rybachuk. And this is one that my grandmother has written next to it that they're very good. So I'm going to assume that if Grandma says they're good, they're good. So this hot water pastry, really, really simple. First off, I've got my bowl sitting here in the sink with a bunch of hot water in it because I want my bowl to be hot to start with. And then I'm taking a cup of shortening and I'm just going to mush that up a little bit so it's in smaller pieces. And to that, I'm going to add, I've got my kettle boiling over here. I'm going to add half a cup of boiling water. And just going to add that in there, and we're going to mix that up until the shortening melts. And once it's all melted, then I'm going to add in 3 cups of flour and a half a teaspoon of salt. Mix it all up, and it'll make a very, very soft dough. And that's why it's important that we do this ahead of time. I'm actually doing it the evening before. We're going to be doing the actual butter tarts tomorrow. Because if it doesn't chill, it would be impossible to roll it out. Much the same as the sugar cookies that we made in an earlier video. If it's not chilled, it just sticks to the rolling pin and just makes everybody's life miserable. There we go. Now I have here 3 cups of flour. And I'll put in my salt before I forget because that's my favorite thing to do. There we go. Yep. This is actually got to be one of the easiest pastries I've ever come across. Really soft, nice and warm. It actually feels very nice. mixing till all of that flour is incorporated. You can tell that there's no way that you could roll this out. It would just get mushy. But trust me, once it's been properly chilled, it will be great. Okay, so now I'm just going to go and wrap this up, pop it in the fridge overnight, and then it will be ready to go to make our tarts tomorrow. So we'll see you in a little bit. Okay, we're back, and our pastry is well chilled, so it's ready to roll out. And we're going to get ready and make up our filling here. And I have my friend Kathy Christensen here. So Kathy is here not only because she's an experienced cook in her own right, but also she's an expert on some genealogy questions that we might have. And that's one of the things that comes up with a cookbook of this nature, is that we've got all of these names in here. So we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But first we're going to talk about butter tarts themselves, which is as they say, a quintessential Canadian dish. I used to run a B&B, and a lot of times my guests would ask me, what's a typical Canadian food? And I'd list off a few things, butter tarts, Nanaimo bars, whatever. And they said, well, is there any Canadian food that's not a dessert? And I actually had to research it, but the only thing I could find was a lot of pickles and things like that. But because Canada is such a multicultural country, all of our foods are a variety of things, and you know that by looking at my website or my YouTube channel, that there's all kinds of things from all over the world, and that's what we eat. That's true. But desserts are truly Canadian. Now, butter tarts traditionally are brown sugar, eggs, and butter as the filling. It's very similar to the Quebec sugar pie or the American pecan pie fillings. And some of them have syrup in them, some don't. And then there's the other fillings that we put in. It's a big debate whether or not you put raisins in them or whether you have them plain. And then there's the newer ones that have nuts in them, or my favorite is putting bacon in them. So we're going to be doing some of those today. But what I usually do is I'll do a variety. And the other variable, and it depends on where you are, the other variable was be whether or not there's flour in it, which helps thicken it. And there's actually a lot of competition, I'll say. There's actually butter tart competitions every year. And in Ontario, there's places called the Butter Tart Trail and the Butter Tart Tour, where you can travel all through these little towns and test out everybody's favorite butter tarts.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, exactly. So the butter tart recipe that I normally use has syrup in it, but because we're focusing on the Coronation Cookbook, we're going to go with Mrs. Rybichek's butter tart recipe. Now, her recipe actually called for walnuts and coconut. My grandmother is handwritten in here, stroking out the coconut and added currants and dates, but we're going to go with the basics here. So I'm starting with 1.5 cups of brown sugar. Now, my grandmother wrote in there a scant 1.5 cups. And now normally when you're measuring brown sugar, you pack it in. In this case, I just let it be loose. And we're adding 2 tablespoons of flour and 1/4 tablespoon, or quarter of a teaspoon of baking powder. Baking powder is something that's not in all of them, and for that matter, flour isn't in all of them, but we'll go with this one because I'm guessing that this Mrs. Rybichek was quite a cook. She has a lot of recipes in this book. So we'll mix that up. I've got 1/4 cup of butter that I've melted. They don't specify to melt it, but I find that it mixes easier if you melt it.
Sure.
And then we add 2 eggs And that's what's going to thicken things up. Now you'll notice that the bowl that I'm using is one that I use it so it specifically has a spout to it so we can pour it into the filling or into the tart shells. And then I'm going to add a little slosh of vanilla.
And the flour is really going to help thicken it too.
I think so, because that's one of the things with butter tarts is they are so runny that sometimes they're awkward. Right, now I had brought out my little whisk here, thinking I would use that to mix it, but I don't think I'm going to need to. It's
looking nice and creamy.
Oh, yeah. Out of there. Okay, so now we're ready to start rolling out our dough, and that's pretty boring to do that. So this gives Kathy a chance to talk about genealogy and the names. So in 1953, everybody went by their husband's name. So
yeah,
what about that?
And boy, oh boy, that's something that I think is almost limited to the period. Because when I looked at really old records, it seemed to mention women by their names. But you get to that 50s, like post-World War II period, and lo and behold, they're Mrs. Alex Johnson or Mrs. John Doe and that kind of thing. And they sort of disappeared as people for a while, you know, regrettably.
Well, yeah.
But what I love about recipe books like this is you can see in a given community all the different names. And if we only had a census for that period, which we could look at right now, you could compare it to and find out the women's names if you needed to. You know who the heavy hitters of the community are, so to speak, because they tend to be the ones that, you know, put the most recipes in, and you know, maybe they had the most respect or something for their cooking.
Yes, yeah.
They were the ones who would have attended the Sunday suppers and done a lot of the community cooking for those events. That's what I'm thinking. The other thing about a cookbook is what happened in my ancestor's case. My great-grandmother, they didn't have a lot of paper way back, and she was born in 1826. So when you looked at the back of her recipe book, besides she wrote poetry in it, I don't think it was her own poetry.
Okay.
But she collected poems and she wrote those kind of things.
Right.
And she put all the names of her children's births and deaths as it happened. And they were all at the back of her book, so it was like her own private diary.
You know, like some people would do that in the family Bible, but this
That's
was her
what
piece
she
of
had,
paper.
I guess.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing.
Do you want me to push these down for you, Ellen?
Please, if you could. Now you'll notice that I've got this little bowl here because, well, I do have cookie cutters that would work for this. They're all too small, and we want this to fit into muffin tin type size.
Oh, yeah.
And that's one thing with butter tarts is having one that's a little bit deeper because the filling is kind of liquidy. Doing them in a muffin tin versus a tart tin, which are shallower. Now, like I did mention earlier, you know, if I was just making these for myself, I would often just buy the pre-made tart shells, which are not as deep as this. But since I'm making my own pastry, we'll go with that.
Well, this is nice pastry. Seems to be.
It's very soft, and like I said, it's not as flaky as the stuff that I would normally use for pies, but I think it's just right for tarts.
Yeah, I think tarts aren't known for flaky, for being flaky particularly.
Exactly.
They need to hold that liquid.
Yeah. So now, Kathy, one of the things I noticed in this cookbook is that in some cases they use the husband's name, and in some cases they use their own first name. Of course, if the person wasn't married and it's Miss something, it's their own first name. But sometimes it's Mrs. in their own first name. And was there any particular social norm about whether they used their husband's name or not?
Well, it may have been that some who used their own name were widows. Mm-hmm. That could be. And in some cases, women would continue to use their husband's name, I found.
Right.
But, you know, very often if they were widows, eventually they would get around to using their own name. Mm-hmm. So that's a possibility.
Because it depends on how long they've been widowed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And maybe some women were just better known by their first name. Maybe they had a lot of grandkids and neighbors and were a little more familiar. But back then, things were so formal, weren't they?
Oh, yes. Yeah, even in a small town, it was, you were Mrs. So-and-so.
Yeah. And I've seen pictures, you see pictures of people in cities where, you know, the women are all wearing dresses and the men are wearing suits. And
yes, yeah.
It's just a different day now.
Yeah, I remember that as a kid. The lady that used to babysit me, once a week we would go downtown to do the shopping, and it was a big deal. She would get all dressed up and put on her pearls, and there was a necklace that she used to lend me that I would get dolled up too, and then we would go downtown and do our shopping, and we would go to Eaton's or the Bay, and there was always the ladies' lounge. And because everybody would wear, not only dressed up, but high heels, and they'd be out shopping all day.
Oh, yes.
And it was exhausting. And they would go into the ladies' lounge, which was sort of an ante-room to the ladies' washroom. And there was couches and footstools, and they could kick off their shoes and put their feet up.
That's
and
nice.
That was a big part of the socializing then, too,
And maybe they even nursed their babies back then.
Yeah.
Possibly. Although bottles were a thing back then.
That's right, in the 1950s, that's right. That was a big deal. And everybody did have kids. Lots of kids around. And
the baby boom.
Oh, yeah. Now, how many more do we need? Need another 3?
3. Can you get 3 out of that?
I'm sure that I can. It doesn't say in the recipe how many it makes, but I'm thinking that 12 is going to be just the right amount.
Oh, yeah. It looked like about 12 to me. I think in places like Quebec, didn't they call them sugar tarts or something?
Yeah, sugar pie and sugar tarts. And that's where, depending on where you are, you maybe are more likely to get the ones that have maple syrup in them, which adds a difference to the flavor.
Oh, I'm sure. My sister's recipe called for maybe maple syrup. And I don't remember ever having that in a butter tart. I mean to try it one day.
And then this leftover pastry, I'll do that up later, but if you roll it out and just sprinkle a little sugar and cinnamon on it, that makes a fun little cookie. That was something as a kid that was always that little treat that you'd have when somebody was making pie.
Oh, yeah.
And I used to have a friend that was from Quebec, and I don't know the French term for it, but basically it translates as nun's farts. And I guess it's so sweet. And it's leftovers, but it's nice and sweet. So.
That's cute. Are we
Yeah, we're at our 12 minutes, so we're just going to get our fillings ready here. And all right, so we're just going to, I had brought out 2 tart tins, or 2 muffin tins, but we don't need that many.
Okay.
I wasn't sure what we were going to end up with. And so I've got bacon crumbles here. These are the Kirkland brand bacon crumbles, which is real bacon. And so we just put in a little bit like that.
Wow.
Let you carry on there. We've got some raisins for the people that are raisin lovers. And then we've got some nuts for the people that are kind of nuts, which are a lot of my relatives. And if we have 4 of each, that'll give us a nice... Now, do be careful if you've got people that have nut allergies, just to, do those as a separate batch. I'll do a few more raisins. There we go. Alrighty, and then what we do here is we take this lovely mixture. Okay, that should be enough, Kathy. I think we're good.
Okay. I didn't know if you needed...
Now that I've given you the idea of the bacon, you're going. And we just fill up our tins the rest of the way with this filling. And thank goodness I have this silicone muffin tin, because otherwise this would be messy as could be. This is going to be ooey gooey good.
It could be. Always an adventure, when you're trying out an old recipe book. I mentioned this to my grandkids, and that we were going to be using a cookbook for 1953, and they looked at me like this was ancient.
I know, did they really cook back then? Okay, now I am going to wipe up some of this excess, because that will just make a... Okay, now we're going to pop these in the oven. It says a moderate oven, so that's 350 degrees for 12 to 15 minutes. And we will see you when we're done. Okay. And there we go. All right. We have to let these cool a bit before we eat them, because with the syrup in there, they are, really just something that's going to burn like crazy. Yeah. But we'll let them, I think I'm going to let them cool in place there. That will firm up the pastry a little bit, as well as firm up the filling. Mm-hmm. You can see how the eggs and the baking powder have caused it to rise up a little bit. And anyway, so we'll see in a few minutes after this has had a chance to cool.
They look good.
Okay. All right, so we're back. We got them out of the holder. We did cut into one. They are very ooey gooey. They're still quite warm. As they cool, they will get that they're firmed up a little bit. But in the meantime, you can see how just delicious and syrupy and creamy these are. So I hope that you enjoyed today's episode of Hilltop Stovetop, where we've made traditional butter tarts and a hot water pastry from the Teulon United Church Circle cookbook, commemorating the coronation of Queen Elizabeth. And as we mentioned, this is Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee. And, that's just telling me that my other little treats are done in the oven. And I also want to thank my guest chef, Kathy Christensen, and hope that you'll join us on our next episode. In the meantime, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on anything. Bye-bye for now.
Bye.